Today we are going to go over the plot of the famous play An Inspector Calls by JB Priestley. Whether you're studying this for an exam or you just want to understand the play better, this is going to be the perfect video for you. So let's get straight into Act 1. The play is set in 1912 in the home of the wealthy Burling family in the fictional town of Brumley. It begins with the Burlings finishing a luxurious meal and then celebrating the engagement of Sheila Burling to Gerald Croft. Mr. Burling speaks about how pleased he is that Sheila and Gerald are to be married, but mainly because it will progress his business prospects with the Croft family. Interestingly, he doesn't really speak about the love between his daughter and her new fiancé. Instead, he's just excited about this development for his own financial gain. This immediately sets up Mr. Burling as a character who's just self-interested and lacking any sort of empathy and understanding for others, even his own daughter and her upcoming marriage. The family toasts and Gerald gives Sheila an engagement ring, to which she exclaims she only now feels truly engaged. It is implied that she feels the engagement ring, which is most likely very expensive, is the actual symbol of her engagement rather than the love between her and Gerald. Mr. Burling then gives a pompous speech about progress, famously mentioning that the Titanic is unsinkable and how there will definitely be no war with Germany. This is ironic to the audience, since the audience in 1945, when the play was first performed, and even modern-day audiences now, knows that World War I and II both happened, as well as the sinking of the Titanic. This shows Mr. Burling as a character that the audience feels makes very bold statements that are quite often wrong. Priestley intended this to happen, so that when Mr. Burling disagrees with the overall messages of the play, that communities should support each other, the audience then believes that he is wrong again. Just after this happens, an unexpected visitor arrives at the house in the form of Inspector Goole. Mr. Burling tries to impose authority on the inspector, stating that he used to be Lord Mayor, but Inspector Goole is clearly unbothered by his claims. He announces that a young working-class woman named Eva Smith has died by suicide after drinking disinfectant, and he is here to investigate her death. His blunt revelation shocks the audience and helps them to feel sympathetic towards Eva, as well as understanding that Inspector Goole is very no-nonsense. The inspector proceeds to question each family member in turn, revealing that they all had a part to play in her downfall. Mr. Burling is questioned first. We learn that he fired Eva from his factory for taking part in strikes asking for higher wages. He viewed her as one of the organisers of this strike and therefore dismissed her from her job. This again shows him as a man of little empathy and driven by money and power. He refuses to take any responsibility for her death. Sheila is next, and the inspector shows her a picture that we can only assume is Eva Smith, but the audience never actually gets to see this picture. Eva had found a new job at a department store where Sheila was a regular customer. Sheila was trying on a dress, but it ended up not looking good on her, when she saw Eva smiling at an assistant. She assumed that they were both making fun of her, and she complained to the manager, and she said the store didn't want to lose the business of a wealthy family like the Burlings, and therefore Eva Smith was then fired from the department store for her actions. Sheila is deeply shaken, and she feels really guilty about this, unlike her father. She ends up running out of the room crying. By the end of Act 1, the inspector turns his attention towards Gerald Croft. He explains that Eva changed her name to Daisy Renton, and it becomes clear that Gerald knows this name. Gerald intends to keep his affair a secret, but it is implied that Inspector Goole knows. He ends the act with the one-worded question, "Well?" implying that Gerald is going to admit his affair after all, but still keeping the audience in suspense for Act 2. Act 2 starts where we left off with Inspector Goole asking, "Well?" to Gerald again. It's suggested that Sheila should leave as Gerald's story might have an effect on her. At the time the play is set, there was this common idea that women were fragile and shouldn't experience things that were alarming or might be upsetting to them. Although the inspector points out that the Burlings didn't have this same view towards Eva, who went through many traumatic experiences at their hands. Mr. Burling appears to be growing tired of this, and he tells the inspector to get on with questioning Eric so that he can go to bed. But again, showing his power, the inspector ignores this request and gets back to Gerald. Gerald then reluctantly admits in front of Sheila that he had a secret affair with Eva, who is now using the name Daisy Renton. He met her at a theatre bar that's often frequented by prostitutes, but he claims that she was different and it made her stand out to him. This is also the same bar that Eric meets Eva in. Gerald says that Eva was being harassed, so he took her to a nearby hotel bar for a drink, and then they ended up talking about her lives and her hardships. After hearing her story, he agrees to help her out by arranging food for her, and then a few days later, he finds her a place to stay and gives her some money. Although Gerald insists that he wanted nothing in return, he keeps her as his mistress before breaking things off when he goes away on business. Inspector Gould confirms that Eva moved away from Brumley to the seaside for a short while. Unlike Mr. Burling, Gerald seems to show some remorse. Sheila is heartbroken and returns his engagement ring. Gerald then leaves the house to go for a walk. The inspector turns his attention to Mrs. Burling and shows her a photo of Eva, who she claims not to recognise. Sheila is evidently distressed at the family's involvement and tries to get her mother to admit whatever role she's played in Eva's downfall. Mrs. Burling is a committee member for a charity that is designed to help women in need, but she actually refused to help Eva when she came asking for assistance, as she didn't use the name Eva Smith or Daisy Renton, but instead she used the name Mrs. Burling. The real Mrs. Burling took offence to this, and this influenced her decision not to help her out. Mrs. Burling coldly states that the father of Eva's unborn child should take responsibility, but she is completely unaware that the father is her own son, Eric. Mr. Burling is very concerned that Gerald might be the father, and that all of these events might affect his social standing. Mrs. Burling, however, decides to blame her own daughter and husband for Eva's death, trying to shift the responsibility off of her, truly believing that she has done nothing wrong. As tension builds, Eric arrives and the audience is left on edge at the end of the act as we anticipate his confession. Now for the final part of this story in Act 3. Eric sees no point in hiding things from the inspector as he believes that he knows the story already. Sheila tells Eric about Mrs. Burling's idea that the father of the child should take responsibility, and Eric's drinking problem is brought up and denied by Mrs. Burling. However, Eric does then ask for a drink before he tells the story, which the inspector allows. Eric tells his story and reveals that he met Eva while drunk at the same theatre bar that Gerald met her in. Eric bought her some drinks, walked her home, and then forced himself on her and got her pregnant. He claims not to remember much of it due to his drunken state, and he uses this as an excuse for his actions. A few weeks later, Eric and Eva meet up again and sleep together, beginning a relationship of sorts. Eva then reveals to Eric that she is indeed pregnant with his baby. He later steals money from his father's business to support her, but she is refusing to take any stolen money from him. Eric then finds out that his mother actually turned Eva away from help and then blames Mrs. Burling for her actions. This sparks an argument and the family is in complete turmoil. Inspector Gould then intervenes and he reminds the family that they are all to blame in their own separate way. He delivers his powerful final speech about social responsibility, warning that if society does not learn to care for each other, they will suffer in fire and blood and anguish. He leaves the house, leaving the family shaken. After he leaves, Mr. Burling is still worried about a scandal more than the moral consequences of what he's done. Mrs. Burling still does not accept any responsibility, but Eric and Sheila clearly feel guilty and distressed over what's happened to Eva as a result of their own actions. Gerald then returns from his walk, announcing that he met another police officer who told him that there's no Inspector Gould on the force. Mr. Burling is absolutely delighted and he phones the police constable who once again confirms that there is no Inspector Gould, leading Mr. Burling to then believe that they are now free of any blame again. There's also a phone call to the hospital that reveals there's no suicide case, and Mr. and Mrs. Burling are relieved. However, Sheila and Eric remain deeply affected by what they've learned. They insist that even if the inspector wasn't real, they've all treated a woman poorly in different ways and that's what they should be focusing on. Mr. and Mrs. Burling try to return to celebrating like they were at the start of the play, and Gerald attempts to give Sheila the engagement ring back, but she refuses to accept it, saying it's too soon. Just as the family is settling down again, the phone rings. Mr. Burling picks it up, and we are told that a girl has died by swallowing disinfectant, and that a real inspector is on his way to ask the family questions about her death. The play ends with this shocking twist. Well, what an ending. The play certainly leaves us as an audience with so many questions. Who was the inspector? How did he know what was going to happen? Was Eva Smith real? Was she one person? Was she multiple women who suffered at the hands of the privileged? Let me know in the comments what your answers are to all these unanswered questions. Thanks for watching and I hope you found this video useful.